Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Insights by Indicio. I'm your host, Tim Spring, and today I'm joined by Deputy CTO Sam Curren, and he's here to discuss DEGov, decentralized ecosystem governance, and the best methodology for setting rules for your ecosystems. Thank you again for joining me today, Sam. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an architect here at Indicio, and I work with community contributions for our open source involvement, as well as both Indicio internal architectures and and architecture for customers. I'm involved in the community both with DIDCOM based efforts and in the Hyperledger Aries community. So I'm glad to be here talking about this. This is an important topic.
All right, awesome. Yes, I agree, and I also think it's a fairly complex topic. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to start by just breaking down the term decentralized ecosystem governance, starting with the term ecosystem. So what kind of comprises the ecosystem?
So I'm not going to be spouting dictionary definitions here. So I'm going for sort of clarity and common language, and I hope that there's a little bit of grace given in that. An ecosystem is the participants is all of the participants involved in a particular interaction. That could be all sorts of types of folks. In a school ecosystem, for example, you have teachers, you have administrative staff, you have the principal, you have students, you have parents of the students, etc. That's kind of what we mean by an ecosystem, is that all of the participants involved in some aspect of things. Ecosystems overlap in really important ways. For example, a parent that is involved in a school ecosystem is also involved in the ecosystem, perhaps with their job, or with involvement with the local governments, etc. And so ecosystems overlap and are non-exclusive, and are the set of people involved in some aspect of interaction on a regular basis.
All right, sounds good. So what do we mean when we say governance then, and why is governance over an ecosystem important?
So governance is the set of rules within an ecosystem about how people interact with each other. For example, in the open source community of Hyperledger, they have they have policies that govern both the interactions with each other, like what's acceptable behavior, how we interact, not treating each other poorly, etc. Those are governance rules. As well as a lot of these meetings have IPR rules about who's allowed to participate in which ways, to manage the intellectual property rights protection against the work that's being done. So the rules by which all the participants in an ecosystem follow in order to sort of maintain the desired properties of the ecosystem, that's governance. Sometimes it's very official, like it's encoded in law by Congress or some government entity, and sometimes that's very unofficial, in the sense that, like, there's a group of friends that get together and they have like a house rule that you don't talk about politics or something, right? All of those things comprise governance and sort of managing the ways that a community interacts with each other.
All right. So bringing in the final term here, decentralization. How does it look in a decentralized ecosystem? Like, what does that mean when we say that?
So decentralization is a desired property where not all of the power is consolidated in a single entity. And decentralization is important because not all ecosystems are the same, not all the authorities within ecosystems are the same, and allowing for a decentralized approach allows for the appropriate application of the technology to the needs of the ecosystem itself.
Okay. Right, Indicio just announced DEGov, which is a new product to kind of help establish that decentralized ecosystem governance. Could you tell me a little bit about that and what the technology behind DEGov is actually doing?
I can. So DEGov, naming things is hard. DEGov is a little bit of a weird term, but shorter for decentralized ecosystem governance. And that's a lot of syllables. So we as humans try to make things nature. So the technology behind decentralized ecosystem governance is something that Indicio is working on with other parties, most notably and actively the Trust over IP. No, sorry, Trust over IP is involved in some of those efforts, but the Decentralized Identity Foundation has two efforts we've been involved in that are under the Claims and Credentials Working Group. That is known as Trust Establishment and Credential Trust Establishment, and those are the foundational technologies behind the standard formats and properties of the underlying technology of DEGov. The foundational idea behind Credential Trust Establishment and the fundamental idea behind DEGov is that it allows an authority in an ecosystem to express their opinion about the interactions within that ecosystem and how it should operate inside of that ecosystem.
But doesn't decentralization, right? Everyone gets the power and a voice and all that. How do you have authorities within that system? What does that mean?
So that's the right question, and it comes up a lot. The architecture is decentralized, which allows for existing authorities to play their respective roles. Authorities aren't new in governance, and ecosystems aren't new, but they're just now in some ways beginning their translation into the world of digital identity and managing trusted data that credentials enables. And so what we're not doing here is establishing some new authority by which everyone and all ecosystems have to abide. That would be a very centralized way of doing this. But it is important to recognize that within ecosystems, there are authorities whose opinion generally matters to the participants. And this technology enables those authorities to express their opinions about trust and the other aspects of the participants involved. So, for example, there are nations have governments. Governments produce governance that helps to manage that. For example, here in where I live, we have a speed limit on our roads. The speed limit is part of the governance of the ecosystem, and there is an authority in the form of the local sheriff's department that will enforce those speed limits. And if I drive excessively fast, then I can be ticketed or fined, or even have my license removed from me. And so this isn't establishing new centralized way of doing things, but rather allowing the existing authorities to express what already exists in the governance that mostly already happens, but in a digital way that facilitates the interactions that we have with things like verifiable credentials.
Okay. And you bring up an interesting point there with obviously, right, the sheriff kind of enforcing the speed limit. Who enforces these policies on a decentralized ecosystem?
So when we're speaking of this technology as applied to verifiable credentials, it's always the verifier. The verifier of a credential needs to be confident of two things to accept the credential. They need to have trust in the cryptography, meaning that the data has not been tampered with since it left the issuer, since it was created and issued by the issuer, and they need to actually trust the issuer. They need to know that the issuer was in fact recognized by the authority within the ecosystem to do so. For example, I live in the state of Idaho in the United States. The state of Idaho is authorized to grant driver's licenses to people who are allowed to drive cars. Here are licensed drivers. I am not a valid issuer of a driver's license. So Tim, I could issue you a driver's license credential, but no one would care about it because no one cares that what I think about driver's licenses, but they do care about the state of Idaho from that aspect. And so it allows for the recognition of authority. So if you receive a driver's license, if someone is verifying a driver's license credential to make sure that you're a licensed driver, then they need to trust that the license has not been tampered with. That's the cryptographic side. And they need to know that it was issued by a party that actually should be able to issue those driver's license credentials. And in that case, and in my location, that would be the state of Idaho.
All right, awesome. No, thank you. That paints a very clear picture of it. So is this kind of the main way of implementing governance? Is there other ways? How has it kind of been done in the past digitally, and why this new method?
It's important to recognize that governance has played a role in software for a long time, but we haven't always explicitly acknowledged it. A lot of these decisions about which issuers, for example, should be trusted in a verifiable credential have, up to this point, been mostly encoded directly in the software itself. We call that hard-coded in software terms, where they list the details about the issuer specifically in software, and then those details encoded in the ship software are used to decide whether credentials should be trusted or not. That's obviously problematic. We have there's a lot of if there's updates needed, it requires a deployment of the software. It's relatively rigid. If one of those entities needs to be removed as trusted, it's not very flexible. And it's also fairly prone to error by directly including it that way, and relatively inconsistent around an ecosystem. So the other approach besides DEGov, decentralized ecosystem governance, is something known as a trust registry, and there's another term used sometimes as a trust list. And there's a little bit of an asterisk here in the conversation, in that not everyone that you hear talking about these things necessarily agrees or has a common definition of what exactly each of these terms mean. But the basic idea behind this is that you have a list of the trusted parties within an ecosystem that can be consulted to decide, for example, if an issuer should be authorized for a particular credential schema. There's a variety of ways of doing this. The most problematic way that I've already talked about is encoding that directly in software. And there are also API-driven trust registry methods for this. And so those are other methods that folks are using besides decentralized ecosystem governance in order to solve this problem.
All right. So you touched on it a little bit there in your answer, and especially the terms of problems with hard coding it directly into the software. But why does Indicio kind of think that DEGov, or decentralized ecosystem governance, is the best way moving forward?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the other approaches and maybe some of the ups and downs of them. Right. So I've talked about hard coded. I think it's not controversial. That's not a great approach. API trust registries, API-driven trust registries are better, but they're not ideal in a handful of cases for scalability, cost, and low barriers to entry. And those things can all be overcome. More limiting is the fact that they have no ability to inform trust decisions that are made offline. If they have to be consulted in real time to make that happen. And there's some privacy leakage involved with using a trust registry in that they can observe the types of trust decisions that are being made. They are simpler to use, and that's a benefit to them, but has enough downsides that that's not the approach that we recommend. Decentralized ecosystem governance, by comparison, is a little bit more complicated, but we think for good reasons. That complexity is often managed by the use of libraries that can help you process these formats. It supports offline processing with cached assets. It has a low barrier to entry in particular. It's far cheaper to create and publish a document that manages governance. We sometimes call that a machine-readable governance file. It's far cheaper to create and then publish that somewhere than it is to run a live API that must remain online and respond to requests and be able to scale in a very large fashion. And so we favor decentralized ecosystem governance because of these attributes. Governance is not a thing that will only happen at a large government level or with very big institutions. We believe that governance happens at all scales and levels, and it's important to us that participants at all sizes and capabilities be able to be involved as appropriate within the ecosystems they're involved in. So the governance of who recognizes which international driver's licenses, you can imagine, would be a very large ecosystem example. But I also might have a frequent customer card at the local Shave Ice food truck here in town, and in both of those are examples of ecosystems that can help to manage that. We favor solutions that allow that to happen and that are based on standards and free from vendor lock-in, in the sense that you are capable of, over time, managing the governance of your ecosystem in a different way and not tied to a specific vendor.
All right. Well, no, it all definitely sounds pretty cool. How would you be able to get started? Can you use it today? Is it like out there? What are the next steps for this?
So it's important to recognize that this is advancing technology, meaning we have stuff today, but it is moving forward. There are specification work underway at the DIF, and we're about to mint version 1 of one of the specs called Trust Establishment, and there is work that Indicio is involved with to also establish these other standards that relate. Credential trust establishment is the one that I'm speaking of, that specifically applies the trust establishment principles to verifiable credentials. It's necessary to understand that you can use stuff today and it will be advancing. One of the things that Indicio is doing for our customers is helping to manage the gap between what they need to do and accomplish today, but also be able to adjust and adapt in the future to handle the necessary changes as the technology advances and as community standards are improving.
Awesome. Well, it looks like that is about our time for today. If you were interested in learning more about verifiable credential technology, please go ahead and subscribe, and we'll continue to bring you some more educational content. If you have any questions or specific topics that you'd like for us to cover, please go ahead and leave a comment below. We'll be sure to read and address them. And thank you again to you, Sam. If people want to learn more about this technology, where would you suggest they look?
Absolutely. You can come. We've got some posts that are up, and we'll have more information that we can share. If you want to get down into the process of creating these community standards, then there are conversations at the Decentralized Identity Foundation about the credential trust establishment that you are welcome to become involved in. There's also ongoing discussions with the Trust Over IP Foundation about how we can, as much as possible, blend the concepts and the common technologies between their trust registry concept and decentralized ecosystem governance. And so we'd love to have you involved.
Perfect.